The scream cut through the afternoon air like a blade, sharp and raw, echoing off the swing sets and monkey bars as 12-year-old Marcus Williams collapsed to the asphalt. Blood pooled beneath his small frame while children scattered in every direction, their laughter replaced by terror. The playground that had been alive with joy just moments before now pulsed with panic and the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Oh God! Oh God! They shot him!" Keisha Williams' voice shattered as she ran toward her son, her sneakers slapping against the hot pavement. The sound of her anguish mixed with sirens in the distance and the desperate sobbing of other parents who had witnessed the unthinkable. Marcus lay motionless, his Spider-Man backpack still strapped to his shoulders, homework spilling out onto the ground where chalk hopscotch squares had been drawn just hours earlier. The Riverside Elementary playground had always been a sanctuary, tucked between oak trees that provided blessed shade during Alabama summers. It was where children came after school to burn off energy before dinner. Parents gathered on benches, chatting about work and weekend plans while keeping watchful eyes on their kids. It was Tuesday, September 15th, and the air still held summer's heat, even though school had been in session for 2 weeks. Earlier that afternoon, Marcus had been the undisputed king of the basketball court, his friends cheering as he made shot after shot. "That's how we do it in Riverside," he had shouted, pumping his fist in the air. His best friend Jerome had laughed and stolen the ball, starting a chase that led them through the playground equipment. Other children joined in, creating an impromptu game of tag that had everyone breathless with laughter. Among the parents watching was Patricia Thompson, a substitute teacher who lived 2 blocks away and knew most of the neighborhood children by name. She had been chatting with Maria Santos about the upcoming school fundraiser when she noticed a white woman standing at the edge of the playground, talking rapidly on her phone. The woman's voice carried across the space, sharp and agitated. "Yes, I want to report suspicious activity," the woman was saying, her free hand gesturing toward the children. "There's a group of them, and they look dangerous. One of them has what looks like a weapon." Patricia frowned, following the woman's gaze. She saw the same children who had been playing there every day since school started. Marcus was shooting baskets with Jerome and Tanya. 8-year-old Malik was on the swings with his sister. Near the sandbox, 10-year-old Cody Henderson, the only white child in the group, was playing with a bright orange toy pistol he had brought from home, making shooting noises as he chased imaginary aliens. The woman on the phone was Karen Whitley, though most of the neighborhood parents didn't know her name. She had moved to the area 3 months ago and immediately began attending city council meetings to complain about declining property values and undesirable elements in what she called her neighborhood. She had called the police twice about loud music from weekend barbecues, and once about a group of teenagers walking home from school. "Ma'am, what exactly are you seeing that concerns you?" the dispatcher asked. Karen's eyes locked onto Marcus as he ran toward the water fountain, his arms pumping with the natural athleticism of youth. "The tall one looks older than he should be," she said, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper. "And aggressive. They're all being loud and threatening." The dispatcher, following protocol, asked for more details. Karen provided them eagerly, describing a scene that bore no resemblance to the innocent playground games actually taking place. In her telling, the children were menacing and out of control, and she was afraid for her safety, despite standing 50 feet away from a completely normal afternoon of play. Patricia Thompson watched Karen with growing unease. Something about the woman's posture and tone set off alarm bells. She had taught in this district for 15 years and recognized the particular brand of fear that had nothing to do with actual danger and everything to do with prejudice. "Maria," Patricia said quietly to her friend, "I think that woman is calling the police on our kids." Maria Santos, a nurse at the county hospital who had seen the devastating effects of bias countless times, felt her stomach clench. "Should we go over there?" Before Patricia could answer, two police cruisers rounded the corner, their engines growling as they approached the playground. The officers inside had received a dispatch about multiple juvenile suspects, possibly armed, causing a disturbance at Riverside Elementary Playground. Officer Brian Kowalski, 28 years old and 3 years on the force, was driving the lead car. His partner, Officer Michael Chen, was newer to the department and had been trained to follow Kowalski's lead. Neither man had asked follow-up questions about the nature of the disturbance or requested more specific information about the alleged weapons. "Control, we're on scene," Kowalski radioed as they pulled up to the playground entrance. "Multiple juveniles visible." The children noticed the police cars immediately. Most kept playing, accustomed to seeing officers around the school and neighborhood, but some of the older kids, particularly those who had been taught to be careful around law enforcement, began to pay attention. "Hey, Marcus," Jerome called out, nodding toward the police cars. "5-0's here." Marcus glanced over and shrugged. "Probably just doing their rounds," he said, though something in his mother's voice echoed in his head. She had sat him down just a few weeks earlier for what she called the talk that every black mother in America eventually has to have with her sons. "If police ever stop you," Keisha had said, her hands trembling slightly as she held his face, "you keep your hands visible. You speak respectfully. You don't run. You don't argue. You don't reach for anything. Do you understand me?" Marcus had nodded, not fully understanding why this conversation was necessary, but sensing its importance in his mother's tone. Now, watching the officers exit their vehicles, he remembered those words. But this was just a playground. These were his friends, his neighborhood, his safe space. Officer Kowalski approached with his hand resting on his service weapon, his eyes scanning the group of children with the kind of intensity usually reserved for felony stops. Officer Chen flanked him, following the positioning they had been taught in training scenarios that emphasized officer safety above all other considerations. "All right, everybody stop what you're doing," Kowalski shouted, his voice cutting across the playground like a whip crack. "Hands where I can see them." The children froze. Some raised their hands immediately, confusion and fear replacing joy on their young faces. Others, particularly the younger ones, simply stared in bewilderment. Cody Henderson, still holding his orange toy pistol, looked around uncertainly. Patricia Thompson stood up from her bench, her heart racing. "Officers, these are just children playing," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her throat. "Ma'am, please step back," Chen ordered, pointing at her. "This is a police matter." "What's happening?" Tanya Williams asked her brother Marcus, her voice small and frightened. At 9 years old, she didn't understand why the police were treating them like criminals. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. As one of the older kids, he knew the younger ones were looking to him for guidance. "Just do what they say," he whispered, raising his own hands higher. Karen Whitley had positioned herself near the police cars, ready to point out the ringleaders she had described in her call. She gestured toward Marcus and Jerome, speaking in urgent whispers to any officer who would listen. "That one," she said, pointing at Marcus. "He's been the most aggressive. And I saw a weapon." Officer Kowalski's eyes fixed on Marcus, seeing not a seventh grader who loved basketball and science class, but a potential threat that matched the profile he had been trained to watch for. Marcus was tall for his age, And like many boys on the cusp of adolescence, his body was beginning to change in ways that could make him appear older to someone looking for reasons to be afraid. "You, tall kid, come here slowly," Kowalski commanded, his weapon now partially drawn. Marcus felt his world tilt. Everything his mother had taught him crashed together in his mind. Comply. Don't run. Hands visible. Speak respectfully. But he was 12 years old, and terror was making his thoughts scatter like leaves in a storm. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I said come here." Kowalski's voice rose, and other children began to cry. From her position near the swings, Maria Santos pulled out her phone and began recording. Her hands shook as she held the device, but her years as a healthcare worker had taught her the importance of documentation when things went wrong. Marcus took a tentative step forward, his hands still raised. His mind raced through everything he had learned about staying safe. But nothing had prepared him for this moment when ordinary childhood play had somehow become a crime scene in the eyes of law enforcement. "Where's the weapon?" Chen demanded, though he couldn't see anything in Marcus's hands. "I don't have a weapon," Marcus replied, confusion evident in his voice. Across the playground, Cody Henderson was still frozen in place, the bright orange toy pistol clearly visible in his small white hands. But the officer's attention was entirely focused on the black children, their tunnel vision preventing them from noticing what should have been obvious. "He's reaching for something!" Karen Whitley suddenly screamed, though Marcus's hands remained clearly visible above his head. The shout triggered something in Officer Kowalski's training, a cascade of split-second reactions that had been drilled into him during academy scenarios: threat assessment, weapon identification, neutralization of danger. But the training had failed to account for the reality of a terrified child who posed no actual threat to anyone. "Don't move!" Kowalski yelled, his weapon now fully drawn. Marcus, overwhelmed by conflicting commands and paralyzed by fear, did the thing that every child's instinct tells them to do when faced with danger. He ran. Not toward the officers, not toward any person or potential weapon, but toward the place where his mother sat every day after work, toward the bench where he felt safest. It was perhaps 20 yards away, past the monkey bars and around the slide where he had played thousands of times before. The sound of gunfire erupted across the playground like thunder. 3 shots in rapid succession, each one echoing off the school building and embedding itself in the memory of every person present. Children screamed and scattered. Parents lunged forward, and Marcus Williams crumpled to the ground near the base of the slide, his childhood ending in a pool of blood and shattered dreams. "Shots fired. Officer needs medical assistance," Chen radioed, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. Keisha Williams, who had been walking from her car toward the playground when the shooting started, now ran faster than she had ever moved in her life. Her son lay motionless on the asphalt, blood spreading from beneath him like spilled paint. "Marcus, Marcus, baby, talk to me," she screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes were open, but unfocused, his breathing shallow and rapid. Patricia Thompson had her phone out, calling 911 for an ambulance, while Maria Santos continued recording the scene with hands that shook so violently she could barely hold her device steady. Other parents were gathering their own children, some in shock, others in rage, all of them trying to process what they had just witnessed. "I can't feel my legs," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the chaos. "Mama, I can't feel my legs." The words hit Keisha like a physical blow. She looked down at her son, her brilliant, funny, basketball-loving son, and saw a future of wheelchairs and physical therapy and a million dreams that might never come true. "You're going to be okay, baby," she said, her voice breaking. "The ambulance is coming. You're going to be okay." Officer Kowalski stood 10 feet away, his weapon still drawn, his face pale with the realization of what he had just done. Officer Chen was securing the scene, moving civilians back, following the protocol for officer-involved shootings. Neither man looked at the child bleeding on the playground. It was then that someone finally noticed Cody Henderson, still standing frozen near the sandbox with the orange toy pistol in his hands. The weapon that had supposedly justified this entire encounter, the threat that had prompted a call to police, was being held by a white child who hadn't been questioned, commanded, or even noticed by the responding officers. "Jesus Christ," Patricia Thompson breathed, pointing at Cody. The gun. The toy gun. It was him. Several parents turned to look, their faces registering the devastating irony of what had just occurred. The child with the toy weapon, the one who should have been the focus of any legitimate safety concern, had been invisible to officers whose attention had been solely focused on the black children playing nearby. Maria Santos, still recording, made sure to capture clear footage of Cody with the toy pistol. Even in her shock and grief, her medical training told her that this evidence would be crucial in whatever reckoning was to come. The ambulance arrived within 6 minutes, paramedics rushing to Marcus's side with equipment and expertise that might save his life, but couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. They worked efficiently, starting IV lines and stabilizing his spine, preparing him for transport to County General Hospital. "Is my baby going to walk again?" Keisha asked the lead paramedic, a woman whose eyes held the kind of compassion that came from seeing too much tragedy. "I don't know, honey," the paramedic said softly. "We're going to do everything we can." As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the distance, the playground fell into an eerie quiet. Children's toys lay scattered where they had been dropped in the panic. A basketball rolled slowly across the court, coming to rest against a fence post. The swing sets moved gently in the breeze, empty now of the laughter they had held just minutes before. Karen Whitley had disappeared sometime during the chaos, slipping away to her car and driving home to her air-conditioned house, where she would later claim to news reporters that she had been trying to keep the community safe. She would tell anyone who would listen that she had done the right thing and that the outcome, while unfortunate, was not her responsibility. But the parents who remained knew better. They had seen her pointing fingers, heard her providing commentary to the officers, watched her create a narrative of danger where none had existed. They had witnessed the birth of a tragedy that might have been prevented if someone, anyone, had simply walked over to the playground and seen what was actually happening rather than what they feared might be happening. Patricia Thompson gathered the scattered homework papers that had spilled from Marcus's backpack, including a math worksheet he had completed during lunch and a science project proposal about renewable energy that he had been excited to discuss with his teacher. The ordinary artifacts of childhood took on devastating significance in light of what had just occurred. "We need to document everything," she said to Maria Santos, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Every detail, every lie that woman told, everything those officers did wrong." Maria nodded, checking her phone to make sure the video had uploaded to cloud storage. "I got most of it," she said. "The commands, the shooting, and the toy gun. All of it." Word of the shooting spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Parents called other parents, children told siblings, and social media exploded with preliminary reports that varied wildly in their accuracy. But the core facts remained constant. A 12-year-old black boy had been shot by police while playing on a playground, and he might never walk again. At County General Hospital, Marcus was rushed into emergency surgery while his mother paced the waiting room, her phone buzzing constantly with calls from family members, friends, and reporters who had somehow already gotten word of the story. She ignored most of them, focusing instead on the updates that medical staff provided every few hours. The bullets damaged his spinal cord. Dr. Sarah Chen explained during one of these briefings. We've stabilized him, and he's going to survive. But the extent of any permanent paralysis won't be clear for several days, possibly weeks. Keisha nodded, though the words felt distant and strange, like someone was speaking a foreign language. Her son, who had been running and jumping and living just hours before, now lay connected to machines that breathed for him and monitored every heartbeat. Meanwhile, the police department was conducting its own investigation into the shooting, following procedures that had been designed more to protect officers than to determine truth. Officer Kowalski was placed on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Officer Chen was assigned to desk duty. Both men would have union lawyers and the full support of their department as they navigated whatever consequences might arise from their actions. The initial police report, filed later that evening, described the incident as a justified use of force in response to a credible threat. It mentioned reports of armed juveniles and described Marcus as a large male suspect who failed to comply with lawful orders and made threatening gestures toward officers. The report made no mention of his age, his size relative to actual adults, or the fact that no weapon had been found on him or anywhere near him. But technology and truth have a way of intersecting, especially when people are paying attention. Maria Santos's video, which she had uploaded to multiple platforms and shared with local news outlets, told a very different story than the official police report. It showed children playing normally, officers arriving with weapons drawn, and a terrified boy raising his hands in surrender before running away in panic. Most damning of all, the video clearly showed Cody Henderson holding the orange toy pistol throughout the entire encounter, completely ignored by officers who were focused exclusively on the black children in the group. By midnight, Maria's video had been viewed more than 1 million times. News vans were setting up outside County General Hospital. Civil rights activists were booking flights to Alabama. And somewhere in the police department, administrators were realizing that their routine officer-involved shooting was about to become a national scandal. The next morning brought protesters to the steps of City Hall, their voices raised in grief and anger as they demanded answers, accountability, and justice for Marcus Williams. Signs reading, "Children are not threats," and "Black Lives Matter" filled the plaza, while news crews from national networks set up equipment and prepared to broadcast the story to the world. Among the protesters was Reverend James Mitchell, pastor of Mount Olive Baptist Church, where the Williams family had worshiped for years. He had baptized Marcus when he was 8 years old, had watched him grow from a shy child into a confident young man who helped younger kids with their homework and always volunteered to carry groceries for elderly church members. "This is not about politics," Reverend Mitchell told the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent fighting for justice. "This is about a child who was playing on a playground and is now fighting for his life because someone looked at him and saw a threat instead of a 12-year-old boy." The crowd responded with amens and applause, their energy building as speaker after speaker shared their own experiences with bias, profiling, and the daily fear that came with raising black children in America. Inside City Hall, Mayor Robert Davidson was holding emergency meetings with Police Chief Helen Rodriguez, city attorneys, and public relations consultants who specialized in crisis management. The video evidence was undeniable. The public outrage was growing, and there was no way to spin what had happened into anything resembling acceptable police work. "We need to get ahead of this," Davidson said, loosening his tie as he reviewed polling data that showed his approval ratings in free fall. "What are our options?" Chief Rodriguez, who had spent 25 years in law enforcement and prided herself on running a professional department, found herself in an impossible position. The shooting was clearly unjustified, but defending her officers was part of her job, even when they were wrong. "The officers followed their training," she said carefully. "They responded to a call about armed juveniles and perceived a threat." "A threat." Davidson's voice rose. "Helen, I've seen the video. That kid had his hands up. He was scared and he ran. That's what kids do when they're scared." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Everyone present knew that careers were on the line, that the decisions made in the next few days would determine not only the fate of the officers involved, but the future of everyone in positions of authority. At the hospital, Marcus had regained consciousness, but was still unable to feel or move his legs. He lay in his bed, surrounded by machines and flowers that well-wishers had sent, trying to understand how his world had changed so completely in the span of a few minutes. "Am I going to be okay, Mama?" he asked his mother during one of her visits, his voice small and uncertain. Keisha Williams, who had barely slept since the shooting, took her son's hand and tried to find words that were both honest and hopeful. "You're going to be different than you were," she said carefully, "but you're still Marcus. You're still brilliant and kind and funny. And we're going to fight to make sure this never happens to another child." Marcus nodded, though tears rolled down his cheeks. At 12 years old, he was old enough to understand the implications of what the doctors were telling him, even when they used gentle language to describe what might be a lifetime of paralysis. Outside his room, lawyers were gathering, civil rights attorneys who specialized in police misconduct cases, personal injury experts who understood the lifetime costs of spinal cord injuries, and advocates who had built their careers fighting for accountability in cases exactly like this one. The lead attorney, Monica Williams, no relation to Marcus, had traveled from Atlanta within hours of seeing the video. She had won settlements in dozens of similar cases and knew that the evidence in this situation was unusually clear-cut. "We're going to pursue both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit," she explained to Keisha during their first meeting. "The criminal case will be about holding the officers accountable for their actions. The civil case will be about making sure Marcus has the resources he needs for the rest of his life." Keisha listened carefully, though part of her mind remained focused on her son's recovery, rather than the legal battles ahead. She was a single mother who worked as a nurse's aide, and the medical bills alone would bankrupt her family without help. But more than money, she wanted justice. She wanted the world to know that her son had done nothing wrong, and she wanted to prevent this from happening to other children. The investigation into the shooting was moving forward on multiple tracks. The state attorney general's office had taken over the criminal investigation from local prosecutors, recognizing the potential for conflicts of interest. The FBI had opened a civil rights investigation, and the police department's internal affairs division was conducting its own review, though few people expected that process to produce meaningful consequences. 3 days after the shooting, the first major revelation emerged. Body camera footage from both officers, which the department had initially claimed was corrupted or incomplete, was released after a court order forced disclosure. The footage confirmed everything that Maria Santos's cell phone video had captured, and more. The audio picked up Karen Whitley's conversation with the dispatcher, including her description of children as threatening and dangerous, despite the visual evidence showing ordinary playground activities. It captured the officers' arrival with weapons already drawn, their failure to assess the actual situation before issuing commands, and their complete focus on black children while ignoring the white child who was actually holding a toy weapon. Most damning of all, the body camera footage showed the final seconds before the shooting with crystal clarity. Marcus Williams, hands raised above his head, backing away from the officers in obvious fear, before turning and running toward a playground bench. There was no aggressive movement, no reaching for weapons, no threatening behavior of any kind. Just a terrified child trying to get away from men with guns who were treating him like a criminal. The release of the body camera footage transformed the public narrative overnight. What police had initially characterized as a justified response to a dangerous situation was revealed to be a catastrophic failure of training, judgment, and basic humanity. News outlets that had initially reported the story with careful neutrality now led with headlines about police brutality and systemic racism. Protests that had been confined to the local area exploded into a national movement. Marches were organized in dozens of cities, with participants demanding not just justice for Marcus Williams, but comprehensive police reform to prevent future tragedies. The hashtag #JoshJusticeForMarcus trended worldwide as people shared the body camera footage and expressed their outrage at what they had witnessed. Within the community where the shooting had occurred, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Many residents were furious about what had happened to Marcus, but others were defending the police and claiming that the officers had been placed in an impossible situation by irresponsible parents who let their children play unsupervised. Karen Whitley, who had initially tried to defend her 911 call as a reasonable response to suspicious activity, found herself at the center of a firestorm of criticism. Her name had been leaked to activists, her address had been posted on social media, and protesters were gathering outside her home with signs reading "Child Killer" and "Racist Karen." In interviews with friendly media outlets, Karen maintained that she had done nothing wrong. "I saw what looked like dangerous activity, and I reported it," she said during an appearance on a conservative talk radio show. "How was I supposed to know they were just playing? They looked older. They looked threatening. I was afraid for my safety." But her defense began to crumble when investigative reporters dug into her background and discovered a pattern of racially motivated 911 calls stretching back months. Phone records showed that she had contacted police about black children walking home from school, about a black family having a barbecue in their own backyard, and about a black teenager delivering newspapers in the neighborhood. Each call told the same story: Karen Whitley seeing black people existing in what she considered her neighborhood and interpreting their presence as a threat that required police intervention. The pattern was so clear that even sympathetic commentators found it difficult to defend her actions as anything other than racial profiling. 1 week after the shooting, the state attorney general announced that both officers would be charged with felony assault and reckless endangerment. The charges were less severe than many activists had hoped for, but they represented the first time in the county's history that police officers had been criminally charged for an on-duty shooting. "No one is above the law," Attorney General Sarah Martinez said during a press conference announcing the charges. "These officers used deadly force against a child who posed no threat to anyone. Their actions were not justified by their training, by the law, or by basic human decency." The announcement was met with cautious celebration by protesters, though many pointed out that charges were only the first step in a process that had historically failed to deliver justice in similar cases. Too many officers had been charged and then acquitted by sympathetic juries, or had received sentences that amounted to little more than slaps on the wrist. At the hospital, Marcus was beginning the long process of physical therapy and rehabilitation that would define the next chapter of his life. His condition had stabilized, and doctors were cautiously optimistic that he might regain some sensation in his legs, though full recovery seemed unlikely. The 12-year-old was grappling with a reality that would have challenged adults twice his age. His friends visited when they could, but their conversations were awkward and stilted, filled with the kind of careful politeness that children use when they don't know what to say. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes, the knowledge that what had happened to him could happen to any of them. "Do you think I'll ever play basketball again?" he asked his physical therapist during one of their sessions. Jennifer Martinez, who had been working with spinal cord patients for 15 years, chose her words carefully. "There are different ways to play basketball," she said. "Wheelchair basketball is incredible to watch, and the athletes are amazing. We don't know yet what your recovery will look like, but there are always possibilities." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. Basketball had been his passion, his identity, his dream for the future. The idea of playing from a wheelchair felt like consolation prize rather than a real solution, though he tried to remain hopeful for his mother's sake. The legal proceedings were moving forward on multiple fronts. The criminal case against the officers was scheduled for trial in 6 months, giving prosecutors time to build their case and defense attorneys time to develop their strategy. The civil lawsuit against the city and police department was proceeding separately, with depositions and evidence gathering that would likely take years to complete. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation had expanded beyond the shooting itself to examine the broader patterns of policing in the city. Federal agents were reviewing years of arrest records, use of force reports, and citizen complaints to determine whether the police department had engaged in systematic civil rights violations. What they found was troubling. Black residents were stopped, searched, and arrested at rates far higher than their representation in the population. Use of force incidents disproportionately involved black suspects, even in cases where the alleged crimes were minor, and complaints about officer misconduct were routinely dismissed or inadequately investigated. The data painted a picture of a police department that had been operating with impunity for years, treating black residents as presumptive threats rather than citizens deserving protection and respect. The shooting of Marcus Williams wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the logical endpoint of a culture that had normalized aggressive, racially biased policing. As the federal investigation progressed, more victims came forward to tell their stories. Parents described children being handcuffed for minor infractions that would have resulted in warnings if committed by white kids. Adults shared experiences of being stopped repeatedly while walking in their own neighborhoods, questioned about their presence in areas where they lived and worked. The accumulation of testimony created a comprehensive picture of how bias had infected every level of law enforcement, from initial 911 calls like Karen Whitley's to final outcomes in courtrooms where black defendants received harsher sentences for identical crimes committed by white defendants. 3 months after the shooting, Karen Whitley was indicted on federal charges of conspiracy to deprive civil rights and filing a false police report. Prosecutors alleged that her pattern of racially motivated 911 calls created a climate that made the shooting of Marcus Williams inevitable. The charges were unprecedented. While false reporting was a misdemeanor in most jurisdictions, federal prosecutors argued that Karen's systematic targeting of black residents constituted a civil rights violation worthy of felony prosecution. This defendant used police officers as weapons, Prosecutor David Chen said during her arraignment. She knew that her false reports would result in aggressive police responses, and she used that knowledge to terrorize her black neighbors. The shooting of Marcus Williams was the predictable result of her campaign of harassment. Karen's arrest sent shockwaves through communities across the country. where similar patterns of racially motivated 911 calls had been documented but rarely prosecuted. The case established a legal precedent that could potentially be used to hold other Karen figures accountable for their role in creating dangerous situations. At the same time, the city was grappling with the broader implications of the Marcus Williams case. Property values in the neighborhood where the shooting occurred had plummeted as news coverage attracted national attention to the community's problems with racial bias. Local businesses were struggling as boycotts organized by civil rights groups discouraged outside visitors from supporting the local economy. Mayor Davidson, facing recall petitions and plummeting approval ratings, announced a comprehensive police reform package that included mandatory bias training, community oversight of police operations, and changes to use of force policies. The reforms were more extensive than anything the city had previously implemented, though critics argued they were too little, too late. "We cannot undo what happened to Marcus Williams," the mayor said during a press conference announcing the reforms. "But we can make sure that no other child suffers, because we failed to address the problems in our police department." The announcement was met with skepticism by community activists who had heard similar promises before. They pointed out that meaningful change would require more than policy adjustments. It would require a fundamental shift in how police officers were trained, how they interacted with communities, and how they were held accountable for their actions. As Marcus continued his recovery, he became an inadvertent symbol of both the trauma of police violence and the resilience of communities fighting for justice. His story was featured in documentaries, discussed in congressional hearings, and cited in academic research about the psychological effects of racial bias on children. The attention was overwhelming for a 12-year-old who had simply been trying to play basketball with his friends. Marcus struggled with anxiety and depression as he adjusted to his new physical limitations and processed the trauma of what had happened to him. Counseling sessions helped, but some wounds would take years to heal, if they ever fully healed at all. "Sometimes I wish none of this had happened," he confided to his mother during one of their quiet moments together. "I just want to be a regular kid again." Keisha Williams held her son's hand and tried to find words that would comfort him without minimizing his pain. "You are still a regular kid in all the ways that matter," she said, "but you've also become something more. You've become a voice for change, whether you wanted to or not. That's a big responsibility, but it's also an important one." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He was still just a kid who loved science and basketball and hanging out with his friends. The role of civil rights symbol felt too big for his shoulders, even as he understood its importance. The trials of the officers and Karen Whitley were scheduled to begin in the spring, nearly a year after the shooting. Legal experts predicted that the cases would be among the most closely watched proceedings of the decade, with implications that extended far beyond the individuals involved. Prosecutors faced the challenge of convincing juries that what had happened to Marcus Williams represented criminal behavior rather than a tragic mistake. Defense attorneys would argue that their clients had been placed in an impossible situation and had responded according to their training and the information available to them at the time. The stakes were enormous. Convictions would send a message that police officers could be held accountable for excessive force, potentially deterring future incidents of police violence. Acquittals would reinforce the perception that officers could act with impunity, potentially leading to more community unrest and further erosion of trust between police and the communities they served. As the legal process moved forward, Marcus Williams continued his physical therapy with determination that impressed everyone who worked with him. He was learning to navigate his world from a wheelchair, adapting to new realities while maintaining hope that his condition might improve over time. His academic performance, which had suffered immediately after the shooting, began to recover as he found ways to focus on his studies, despite the ongoing media attention and legal proceedings. His teachers marveled at his resilience and his continued willingness to help younger students with their homework, just as he had before the shooting. Marcus is still Marcus. His 7th grade science teacher, Mrs. Patterson, observed during a parent conference. He's been through something that would have broken many adults, but he still has that curiosity and kindness that made him special before any of this happened. The comment meant more to Keisha Williams than all the legal victories and media attention combined. Her son was still the compassionate, intelligent child she had raised, even as he navigated challenges that no 12-year-old should have to face. On the first anniversary of the shooting, a memorial service was held at the playground where Marcus had been injured. The space had been transformed into a community garden and memorial park, with flowers and trees planted by volunteers from across the city. A small plaque near the basketball court read simply, "For Marcus Williams and all children who deserve to play safely." Marcus attended the service in his wheelchair, surrounded by family, friends, and supporters who had stood with him throughout his ordeal. He was still adjusting to being in public spaces, still processing the trauma of what had happened to him, but he wanted to be present for the community that had supported him. "This place used to be just a playground," he said when asked to speak to the assembled crowd. "Now it's a place where people remember that children should be protected, not feared. I hope that no other kid ever has to go through what I went through, and I hope that this place helps people remember why that matters." His words were met with tears and applause from the crowd, which included many of the parents who had witnessed the shooting and had worked tirelessly to ensure that Marcus received justice. The community had been forever changed by what had happened on that September afternoon, but it had also been strengthened by the shared commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The trials began 2 months later, with jury selection taking weeks as attorneys on both sides tried to find citizens who could evaluate the evidence fairly, despite extensive media coverage. The proceedings were broadcast live, drawing viewers from around the world who were invested in the outcome. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. Body camera footage, witness testimony, and expert analysis all pointed to the same conclusion: the officers had used deadly force against a child who posed no threat to anyone. The shooting was not justified by law, training, or common sense. Defense attorneys argued that their clients had been placed in an impossible situation by Karen Whitley's false reports and had responded reasonably to what they believed was a genuine threat. They emphasized the officers' training, their limited information at the time, and the split-second nature of the decisions they had to make. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Officer Kowalski was sentenced to 8 years in prison, while Officer Chen received 5 years. The sentences were longer than many observers had expected, reflecting the jury's conclusion that the officers' actions had been particularly egregious. Karen Whitley's trial followed immediately afterward, with prosecutors presenting evidence of her pattern of racially motivated 911 calls and the devastating consequences they had produced. The jury took just 6 hours to convict her on all charges, and she was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The convictions were celebrated by civil rights advocates as a rare example of accountability in cases involving police violence. However, many noted that prison sentences for the perpetrators could not undo the damage that had been done to Marcus Williams and his family. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that legal experts estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. The settlement would provide Marcus with resources for medical care, education, and adaptive equipment for the rest of his life, though no amount of money could compensate for the childhood and mobility that had been stolen from him. More importantly, the settlement included provisions for police reform that went far beyond what the city had initially proposed. New training programs, community oversight mechanisms, and accountability measures were implemented to prevent future incidents of police violence. 3 years after the shooting, Marcus Williams was a sophomore in high school, excelling in his advanced science courses and serving as president of the Student Disability Advocacy Club he had founded. He had regained some sensation in his legs through intensive physical therapy, though he remained dependent on his wheelchair for mobility. His story had inspired changes in police departments across the country, with the Marcus Williams Protocol becoming shorthand for comprehensive reforms designed to prevent racially biased policing. Training programs now included modules on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and appropriate responses to children in crisis. The playground where he had been shot remained a community gathering place, hosting after-school programs and summer camps that emphasized both fun and safety. Children played there every day, their laughter a testament to the community's determination to reclaim the space from the trauma that had occurred there. Marcus often returned to the playground to mentor younger children and to remember both what he had lost and what he had gained. The shooting had taken away his ability to walk and run, but it had also given him a platform to advocate for change and a community of supporters who would stand with him for life. "I don't know if I would change what happened if I could," he said during a speech at a national conference on police reform. "It was terrible, and it hurt me and my family in ways that still affect us every day. But it also led to changes that might prevent other children from going through what I went through. If my story can make other kids safer, then maybe it was worth it." The audience gave him a standing ovation, but Marcus was already thinking about his next speech, his next advocacy project, his next opportunity to turn his trauma into positive change. At 15 years old, he had already accomplished more than many adults ever would, using his voice and his story to make the world a little safer for the next generation of children. The Marcus Williams case had become a landmark in the struggle for civil rights and police accountability. It demonstrated that change was possible, even in the face of systemic racism and institutional resistance. It proved that communities could come together to demand justice and achieve meaningful reform. But perhaps most importantly, it showed that a single child's courage in the face of unimaginable adversity could inspire a movement that would protect countless other children for years to come. Marcus Williams had not chosen to become a symbol or an advocate, but he had embraced those roles with the same determination and grace that had always defined his character. The playground where it all began continued to echo with children's laughter, a sound that had once been silenced by gunfire, but had returned stronger than ever. It was a reminder that hope, like childhood itself, has a remarkable ability to survive even the worst trauma and emerge transformed but unbroken. In the years that followed, Marcus would go on to study biomedical engineering in college, driven by his desire to develop better treatments for spinal cord injuries. His mother would become a nationally recognized advocate for police reform. The officers who shot him would serve their sentences and eventually be released, forever changed by the consequences of their actions. Karen Whitley would complete her prison term and move to another state, where she would live quietly, perhaps finally understanding the devastating consequences of the fear and hatred she had allowed to consume her. The playground would remain a symbol of both tragedy and resilience, a place where children learned that they had the right to play safely, and adults learned that they had the responsibility to protect that right. And somewhere in the sound of children playing, in the bounce of basketballs against backboards, in the laughter that filled the space where tears had once fallen, Marcus Williams' legacy would live on a reminder that even the darkest moments can give birth to the brightest hope for change.